Welcomed. This is a brief biography of the life of John Wesley, who lived from 1703 to 1791. The first question may be, why Wesley? Why think about Wesley? Well, by the time of his death in 1791, there were 75,000 Methodists in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and thousands more in Methodist churches across the United States. Wesley had preached more than 40,000 sermons. He displayed unbelievable energy and fortitude and openness to transformation while enduring near continuous hardship, contention, and rejection. He wrote a major medical text for use in people's homes that remained in print for nearly a century. And he played a hand in organizing countless charities, medical centers, schools, and groups dedicated to helping and advocating for the poor. He formed a church which, though its record was mixed, was on the whole a loud voice condemning slavery and the exploitation of women and of the poor and the marginalized generally. As we will see, the pivotal moment in Wesley's life came with his ministry to destitute coal miners and their children in the fields outside of Bristol. It is no surprise that many members of the Methodist Church and its offspring denominations, for instance, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Wesleyan Church, were at the heart of the 18th and 19th century abolitionist, feminist, suffrage, and free church movements here in the United States. The first women's rights or feminist convention, the famed 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, which took place in Seneca Falls, New York, and featured Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Frederick Douglass, was held in a Wesleyan church. And the Wesleyan church itself was an offshoot of Methodism that split from the UMC in 1843 on an abolitionist platform, one the entire UMC would adopt the next year in 1849. Rather, 6 years later in 1849. Today, there are some 80 million Methodists worldwide, and while John Wesley was far from perfect, both Methodists and we all can fairly honor Wesley as a hero of the faith, which for him would mean that we celebrate him as a hero in the struggle to see God's love concretely abound in justice, community, and joy for all creatures on earth. Of course, our history books make men like Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Carnegie, Andrew Rockefeller, Ford, household names. And recently, secular elites have even begun to scapegoat Christianity and other faith traditions. But on the admirable grounds of love that Wesley celebrates, I would suggest that he is more than the equal of those celebrated for their military, political, or corporate prowess. Let me note that the bibliographic material here is largely drawn from A.C. Outler's introduction to the book he edited of writings, John Wesley. This is it here. Edited writings, and also from Randy Maddox and Jason Vickers' introduction to the Cambridge Companion to John Wesley. There are other sources, but these two I would highly recommend as worthwhile texts for libraries and to read. Within this book, I'm particularly indebted to K.J. Collins, Wesley's Life and Ministry, and Vickers, Wesley's Theological Emphases. Those two articles are very good, as are many others. I would recommend both these books, both these texts, very highly. The second question we might ask is, why biography? Why think about Wesley's biography if we're going to study his theology? And that's because a point that I think is obvious today is that no thought exists and can be understood outside of its context. And so it's important to understand Wesley's thought in his context so we can understand it in its original form as closely as possible, and also so we can be aware as we translate that thought in its context into our own times. So that's why it's important to understand Wesley's biography as we look at his theology. So, in 1703, John Wesley is born on June 28th. That's on the modern calendar. It's June 17th in the Julian calendar, which was in use at the day. He's born on June 28th, 1703, at Epworth, England. It might help to place Wesley in relation to contemporaries from the U.S. whose names are familiar to us. Ben Franklin was also born in 1703. George Washington was born in 1732. Thomas Jefferson, born in 1743. They all are part of this 18th century and would be in parallel sorts of worlds. To roughly have in mind Wesley's age throughout this outline, just subtract 3 from the date. So the vital years of 1738 and 1739, for instance, Wesley is around 35 to 36 years old. That's an easy way to kind of keep track of how old he is. Wesley is the 15th of 18 or 19 children. His most famous brother is Charles Wesley, who lived from 1707 to 1788. He was obviously 4 years younger, but a close companion to Wesley for almost all Wesley's life. Charles is famous for his hymns, a multitude of which are now classics in modern hymnals. Charles Wesley wrote an astounding 6,500 hymns. The output of these two is just simply staggering. Wesley's father was a devout Anglican pastor, which means Anglican means in the Church of England, with a Puritan background. Puritans, in a word, were Calvinists who thought the Church of England remained too Catholic, too much emphasis upon works righteousness, too much focus upon institutional affiliations. Puritans stressed personal and communal piety and purity of doctrine. In today's way of speaking, it might be that the Puritans would say that the Church of England was too much religious without being spiritual, and they wanted to be spiritual. Wesley's mother was Susanna Annesley. Her own father was a Puritan minister. She was extremely devout and reportedly very intelligent. She ran the large and fairly poor household and was a strict disciplinarian who thought that parents should conquer the will of their children in order to raise them to be godly. And apparently she inculcated a real fear of hellfire into John Wesley. In 1709, when Wesley is 5 years old, all of his siblings were rescued from a fast-moving house fire. John alone remained trapped in the house on the second floor, cut off from escape by the flames. One man stood on another's shoulders to get high enough to perform a dramatic rescue from a second-story window of the burning house. Wesley's mother, Susanna, took his unlikely rescue as a miraculous sign, and John apparently accepted his mother's interpretation. He later refers to himself as a brand plucked from the burning, which is a reference to Zechariah 3, 1 through 2. In 1714 to 1720, about the ages of 12 to 18, Wesley is nominated by the Duke of Buckingham for an elite boarding school in London, the Charterhouse School, and there he lives and studies for 6 years, roughly from the ages, again, of 12 to 18. And when he completes his time there in 1720, he's accepted at the Christ Church College, the most elite college of Oxford University. Note that Wesley is intellectually exceptional and extremely well educated. At Oxford, Wesley is deeply influenced by his reading of Jeremy Taylor's Rules and Exercises of Holy Living and Holy Dying, which emphasizes the spiritual significance of spiritual disciplines and practices in life and considers the goal of religion to be holy love. He is also especially influenced by Thomas Kempis's The Imitation of Christ, which contends that Christian life is first and above all about devotion. So what should be privileged is not knowledge of doctrine, but love of God and neighbor. In 1725, Wesley is ordained a deacon in the Church of England, that is, Anglican, He is ordained by Bishop John Potter, who later ordains him as priest. Potter goes on to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is essentially the ecclesial head of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. The monarch is the official head of the Church of England. In 1726, now around the age of 24, Wesley is elected a Fellow of Lincoln College at Oxford University. Note that with this fellowship, at the age of around 24, Wesley has secured lifelong financial security as long as he remains at the college and remains celibate. In 1727, Wesley becomes a teaching fellow and an Oxford University Don. So by age 25, he has secured a prestigious academic appointment, which is to say he could have elected to spend his entire life securely ensconced in one of the world's tallest ivory towers. In 1727, Wesley, though officially still at Oxford, begins assisting his now elderly father in his father's parishes in Epworth and Woot. That word is spelled W-R-O-O-T. I'm not sure I'm saying it correctly. Now, this is more than 100 miles north of Oxford. In essence, Wesley is now working full-time in place of his elderly and failing father. In 1728, Wesley is priested into the Anglican Communion by Bishop Potter. And in 1729 to 30, in that period, he reads William Law's Christian Perfection and William Law's Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life. And according to Kenneth Collins, this leads Wesley, who retains a keen sense of the distinction between the letter and the spirit of the gospel, to understand, and I'm quoting now, the law of God not as a lifeless code, but as a life-giving gift that reflected the excellence of the divine being. In 1729, Lincoln College, quite understandably, insists upon his return to his teaching duties at Oxford University. Remember, he'd been filling out for his dad, like 100 miles north, so not able to get back and forth quickly to Oxford. So they had been understandable about that, but in 1729 they insist he return. And when he does return, he connects with Charles, who was there at that time, his younger brother, and together he becomes, with Charles and others, the leader of a religious revival among a small group derisively nicknamed by their fellow Oxfordians as the Holy Club, or the Bible Moths, or the Sacramentarians, or the Methodists. Methodist, then, is a name initially conceived by Oxford students as a term of derision, and Wesley later deliberately appropriates the term as the name of the movement. The Bible Moths focused upon prayer, reading scripture, eating together, working with the poor, and visiting prisons. They were careful to give any money they did not need for their own immediate bare necessities to charity, and when visiting prisons, they used personal funds when possible to free those who were in prison for debt. Wesley was especially taken by the patristic writings of Macarius the Egyptian, whom we now know was actually Gregory of Nyssa. This means Wesley was deeply, if unwittingly, influenced by Eastern monasticism. As Collins notes, this group used works of piety, that is, prayer, reading scripture, and the Lord's Supper, works of piety, as means of grace, but they also stressed works of mercy. Prisons, visiting those in prison, work among the poor, again, freeing those who they could from debtors' prison, sharing their wealth, all these as essential practices. I will argue these works function de facto in Wesley's life as means of grace, as we will see. But this might be contested perhaps even by Wesley, and we need to be precise about what we mean by grace. This is an issue we'll talk about further when we talk about Wesley's theology. In 1735, Wesley's father dies. Wesley is offered his father's pastorates, but he declines. And in retrospect, knowing what we do now after the fact, we can suppose that he declines the position of his father's pastorates, in part because he is haunted by doubts, or perhaps even in crisis over his own faith. And I say maybe even in crisis because given his job at Oxford, his offer of the pastorates that his father had, in other words, his life is laid out ahead of him in a fairly secure and happy way. Instead, he and Charles leave everything they have known and sail that same year for the brand new settlement of Savannah in the land grant of Georgia. This is 1735. Savannah was only established in 1733. And it was a land grant made to the relatively enlightened, or maybe just strategic, James Oglethorpe, whose original plan for the state was to develop a society of farmers and to prohibit slavery. Now, this was essentially the first settlement of Georgia. So this is down below where the English had established settlements and north of where the Spanish had more established settlements. So this is kind of the last frontier on the East Coast, which means on the whole, Georgia was still the land of a variety of indigenous nations. Primarily, I think, in the region that Wesley went into, the Creek nation. So at any rate, so Savannah is a brand new settlement on the frontier of English colonies, stretching down from the north, and just to the north of the Spanish colonies. They've been more established down in Florida and to the south. Charles was to be Oglethorpe's private secretary and a chaplain at Fort Frederica, which was an English fort on the coast, about 70 miles from Savannah. Fort Frederica is on what is now known as St. Simon's Island. Neither endeavor went well, neither Charles's nor John's, or rather, neither of Charles's endeavors went well, neither as a private secretary nor as a chaplain. And so Charles leaves within 6 months, returns to England within 6 months. Now, to give some context of Savannah, there's no significant interior settlement of what would be called North America at these points. So colonial maps will designate areas with huge blocks of color, but and then with colonial European names over them. But it's important to realize that at this point, most of those areas outside of the forts and the coastal regions of most of those areas are, especially in the interior part of what's now the U.S., those are dominated still by indigenous peoples. And so when you think of Savannah, you really have to, this is really on the very frontier of European settlement. So it's a very small and remote colony. And so when you think of Wesley and Savannah, you used to think in terms of Wesley being in a fairly small rural town. A rural town, really the opposite of Oxford and England, where he was from in every respect. So in terms of Savannah at the time, think in terms of a small settlement near the coast, carved out of immense forests, in a region overwhelmingly controlled by an array of Indian nations. Perhaps in 50 years from now, the comparison would be one of us going to be a pastor on the first settlement of Mars, except there's a lot of Martians and Martian nations there. Because it was a first and small settlement, the relationships with I think largely the Creek Indians were friendly and still just developing in the time that Wesley was there. So he was there in this brief initial period when Savannah was still largely idealistic and officially anti-slavery. That should not be confused with non-racist. And of necessity, of course, they were peaceful because they were relatively powerless in the area. They were in some conversation with the Creek. Wesley had wanted to mount a mission to what he called the Indians, but this never materialized. And so this was very kind of early stages but fairly an isolated colony at this point. It's possible by the later 1730s slavery was in view within Georgia, and by 1750 slavery was legalized in Georgia and soon ran rampant. But these developments largely postdate Wesley. Wesley later confesses his chief motivation in going to Georgia is to save his own soul, to learn the true sense of Christ by preaching it to the heathen. In other words, in the immediate wake of his father's death, Wesley makes a radical move because of a lack of conviction about his own faith. This must be read back into our understanding of his previous years ministering in place of his father and at Oxford, and his understanding of his development in those years. Wesley set sail from England to Georgia on October 14th, 1735. One of the most significant events in Wesley's life takes place on this journey across the Atlantic. He is sailing on the Semins, and in the middle of the Atlantic they run into a terrible storm. Their relatively small boat is tossed in seas so mountainous that there's no way even to control the helm. The ship is utterly at the mercy of a raging sea. And these are small wooden ships at this point. Hard for us to imagine being a ship in that size in the ocean. So at any moment, the ship could be swamped and everyone would be rapidly sucked right with the ship down into the Atlantic. If any of you have ever been on a damaged plane, hoping to make it to an airport and survive a crash landing, or if you've waited to find out the stage of the cancer, which says whether or not it can be treated, you'll have a sense for Wesley's experience here. Throughout the mortal ideal, though, a group of Moravians who are also on the boat coming to Georgia so they can have a Moravian community there, they're fleeing persecution in Europe, they remain calm throughout the storm. The storm passes, the ship survives, and in retrospect, Wesley reports in his journal, "This was the most glorious day which I have hitherto seen." That's Collins in the Cambridge Companion, page 46. That sense of its glory, of course, depends in part on having survived the day. Now, the Moravians are an offshoot of the Pietist movement of Philip Spener. They were, as I mentioned, a persecuted minority in Europe, and some sought refuge by fleeing to the Americas. Others found refuge at Herrnhut, Moravian community in what is now Germany. Germany didn't exist then, but in what is now Germany under the spiritual leadership and political protection of Count Zinzendorf. We'll get back to Count Zinzendorf and Herrnhut shortly. All right, in 1736, that's all in the 1735, the boat, the Simmons. In 1736, still troubled over his faith, Wesley seeks out August Spangenberg, the leader of the Moravians who have fled to Georgia, and he looks for his counsel. Spangenberg poses a series of questions to Wesley. Here are the questions. Have you the witness within yourself? Does the Spirit of God bear witness with your spirit that you are a child of God? Do you know Jesus Christ? Do you know yourself? Now, the experience on the Simmons, combined with the questions of Spangenberg, are transforming catalysts in Wesley's self-reflections. Because Wesley says that while in his spoken responses to these questions, he tried to give the appearance that he had sound answers, inwardly, to himself, he thought everything he said only amounted to vain words. Words from a religion of the head and of custom, a religion about which he lacked conviction, not a faith of the heart. In today's parlance, one again might say that Wesley judged himself to be religious, but not spiritual, to be wearing the empty shell of a faith. He does not know how to give answers he thinks are honest, and so he says that while he is a servant of God, engaging in good works as a pastor and a missionary, he is not yet, in the sense of Spangenberg's questions, a child of God. Now, apart from the crisis of faith, which crystallized during Wesley's time in Georgia, his time in Georgia was a disaster. As Outler says mildly, he was an immature, tactless pastor. He fell in love with a Sophie Hopke, the 18-year-old niece of the bailiff of Savannah. Collins Outler says that Wesley's long-standing social inhibitions clashed with his genuine affections, so he made a mess of the relationship. Sophie resolved the issue by marrying a rival suitor. Wesley responded by barring her from Holy Communion. Remember, all this in a small fishbowl town. The new husband sues Wesley for defamation. A formal grand jury is formally convened, and Wesley is indicted on 12 counts. The trial drags on, and after 6 months of what Wesley describes as harassment, he flees back to England on December 22nd, 1737. He arrives back, so he flees in December 1737. In February of 1738, he lands back in England, whereupon he rapidly forms a religious society at Fetter Lane in London with the help of the Moravian leader there, Peter Bowler. It's here, on May 24th, at the Fetter Lane Society meeting, on May 24th, 1738, where he has his famous Aldersgate experience. And I think it's important to remember how quickly he has moved from the utter disaster and failure of his mission in Georgia to setting up a society in England, consulting with the Moravian leader here, and setting up the Fetter Lane Society. His resilience and energy and desire to seek out counsel and then act, to engage and act, is just stunning here and throughout his life. Now, it is here on May 24th on Aldersgate Street, at the meeting of this Fetter Lane Society that he had established, he's listening to a reading of Martin Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans, and he says he suddenly found his heart strangely warmed. In some later writings, Wesley himself stresses the significance of this night, which has become famous as his Aldersgate moment of conversion. But, as Outler is careful to make clear, Wesley writes shortly thereafter in his journals of ongoing spiritual malaise. So while the Aldersgate moment may be symbolically important to Wesley, it should not be overemphasized in relation to Wesley's spiritual journey. Now, in this regard, let me digress momentarily and note how his lived experience of continued doubts and uncertainties, which are only gradually assuaged, is consistent with his conviction that there are degrees of faith in insurance, which will come up as a place where he is contrary to the Moravians. Also, let me say, relate with some confidence, and you can find this in the library, that if you read Luther's preface to Luther's Romans commentary, you will find it quite mundane, and so it truly must have been a work of the Spirit to have moved Wesley at that point. All right, in the summer of 1738, Wesley travels to the Germanic territories. So unified Germany as a modern empire nation-state is not created until 1871, when it's unified by Otto von Bismarck. So at this point, this is a collection of territories in what will become Germany. And he goes there in order to visit Count Zinzendorf's Moravian community at Herrnhut. On July 4th, Wesley meets Count Zinzendorf, but he is disillusioned when he sees signs of self-righteousness and the beginnings of a cult of personality developing around Zinzendorf. So he begins to distance himself from the Moravians. We'll see more of this when we talk about the theology of Wesley and his differences from the Moravians. I think in this regard, though, it's interesting because as he later becomes a leader of the movement, it doesn't seem like there is a cult of personality of a like kind that develops around him. In fact, there's a lot of dissension, a lot of a lot of power struggles. Maybe he had no choice in that, or maybe also in the way he organized things and distributed power, he avoided some of the dangers he thought Zinzendorf had fallen into. In October of that year, still 1738, he reads Jonathan Edwards and about the Great Awakening, the Jonathan Edwards of the Great Awakening in New England. He's impressed in large part by Edwards. He edits out Edwards' high Calvinism, which he disagrees with, and he publishes extracts of Edwards' sermons and works. And Alka claims that it's at this point that Wesley begins to develop the essential parameters of his mature theology. He will publish a response to Edwards and Calvinism the following spring. So note still that we are less than a year from the disaster in Georgia and his flight back to England. So his resilience and energy and moving forward and openness to transformation, seeking guidance, reading various books, all in his mid-30s, which is his mid to late 30s, is where his own theology and understanding begins to crystallize. And we're just about to come up to what is even more than the Aldersgate experience, the pivotal event, which it comes in 1739 in April, who, after some convincing, he has to be convinced, goes to preach under his Anglican ordination to people in the fields surrounding Bristol. Now, he needs convincing because there's no church, and Wesley thought preaching outside of the church was sacrilege. Now, his problem is not preaching outside without a building, but outside of the boundaries of any particular congregation. But once he's convinced to go, he goes, and he starts preaching in the fields. He's preaching almost wholly to impoverished laborers. Among the worst off are the poor workers who are the coal miners of Kingswood and their families. And a revival had begun in Bristol under Whitefield, who had convinced Wesley to come and take up the work. And when Wesley goes, he is simply stunned by the response he receives. People were visibly affected, converted, and revived, finding unexpectedly just what he's looking for, and he hoped to go to Georgia. In other words, to find conviction through his preaching and his ministry. The people's response became a potent source of Wesley's conviction about the truth of the gospel he was preaching. So this is the beginnings of the English Methodist revival of 1739 to 1749, which began among impoverished masses in the fields of Bristol. And here Wesley himself was both the main evangelist and among those who was revived and converted. It's not the famous Aldersgate experience, and I owe this point to Outler, and others have noticed too perhaps, but I'm getting it from Outler. But in the wake of Bristol, Outler says, Wesley's expressions of doubt over his faith drop almost wholly from his journals. And so Outler argues that it's Wesley's ministering to the impoverished in the fields of Bristol which marks the pivotal personal turning point. And we can say things have been coming to a head, and then he's prepped for this. But Wesley is decisively saved by his own preaching, after all. And this experience of growth in faith, and how this growth follows not only from the traditional means of grace, but also from works of mercy, we were going to find reflected in Wesley's mature theology. So let's take a moment to reflect realistically on Wesley as a person. He's raised as a preacher's kid, and I'm going to just speak in kind of contemporary terms, just for trying to make it feel real. He's raised a preacher's kid by an overbearing fundamentalist mother who feared him with fear of hell. In personal matters, he is naive, hurtful, immature, and he struggles with basic human relations. He also struggles with what he is sure are the shortcomings of his faith. He just cannot believe the ideas he has been told he should believe. And far more significant, he has a sense that somehow belief in ideas is not what real faith should be about anyway. And he keeps reading books that say this. Throughout all of this, he remains faithful to the ethical and missiological mandates of the faith as he understands them. Radically so in his lifestyle. And at the same time, he's reflective. He's open to new ideas. He is extraordinarily bright and industrious. He consistently lives out Christian ideals of service as ministry, and he's adaptable, open to learning from others, even those outside of his spiritual communion. He consistently seeks out spiritual community, right, to be part of the Fetter Lane Society, to be part of the Oxford Moths, places where there's going to be mutual accountability, and he is remarkably resilient. Nothing has come easy. The things that did come easy to him are things he wasn't satisfied in, right? The Oxford Donship, the fellowship at Lincoln College. Where he wanted to succeed is where he had the most struggle, but he remains remarkably resilient and active. So everything that happens in Bristol, all this transformation happens within 2 years of his return from the disaster and humiliation of Savannah. So throughout, in his practices, ministry, and reflection, he is in fact experiencing, in his lived experiences, the dynamics of a journey of faith that will inform his mature ministry and theology. In particular, his performance not only of means of grace, but of works of mercy as a source of increased assurance and conviction and faith, we're going to see will vitally inform his understanding of the relationship between works and faith. Later in 1739, in April, Wesley preaches and publishes Free Grace, where he distinguishes his theology from John Edwards' Calvinism. Later in 1739, 8 to 10 people approach him, fearful over their sinfulness and fearful over the wrath to come. And these become the first United Society that he forms. More about the United Societies momentarily. In 1740, Wesley starts the Kingswood School for the impoverished children of the coal miners, whom he has encountered in his ministry in Bristol. Over the course of his career, Wesley reacts to a lack of educational opportunities for people by founding numerous schools and a college. Now, the United Societies, which I mentioned a moment ago, they started in 1739 and really grow from 1739 to 1744. These United Societies, groups of 8 to 10 people, grow. Wesley uses helpers, who are essentially lay preachers, and then assistants who oversee the helpers to run the United Societies. Now remember, at this point, the revival movement is still within the Anglican Church, operating under Wesley's ordination. And this is like with Luther, who was a priest of the Catholic Church, who initially looked only for reform within the Catholic Church, not a wholesale reformation giving birth to communions of faith outside the Church. And at this point, Wesley, too, strongly resists separation from the Church of England. He still intends Methodism to be a reforming order within the larger communion, and he wants to transform that very powerful and influential communion, the Anglican Church, the church within which he was raised, not to become a marginalized splinter group. Now, in this sense, part of his resistance may have been strategic, but also I don't think there's any reason to doubt there would be some genuine hope that the communion in which he was raised and ordained, that he could transform and remain within that communion. Nonetheless, with these United Societies, and I've gotten behind here on this, with these United Societies, and the helpers and the assistants to oversee the helpers, he's developing the structures, of a church, of a denomination, and so one can see, even though Wesley is not intending to create a separate organization, he's setting up a structure which it will allow that organization to emerge as a separate entity if there can't be reform within. In 1744, another key step in this transition, he organizes the assistants and helpers into a conference. He creates the office of steward to raise money for the poor and to meet expenses of societies. In particular, Collins says, and I think it's worth quoting Collins here, Wesley sought money from the rich for the poor, collected clothing on their behalf, established a medical dispensary, gave loans to those in need, visited the sick and dying, helped provide housing for widows and orphans, supported education at the Kingswood School, which he had supported, remember, and elsewhere, preached against the dangers of riches, and wrote forcefully against the horrible institution of American slavery, quote, the vilest that ever saw the sun, unquote. So that is Wesley and his emphases. And so when it says he created the office of steward to raise money for the poor and to meet the expenses of societies, that raising money for the poor truly is the first job and the primary job of the steward. Remember, previously the Oxford Moths would use their own money that anything they didn't need, kind of for basic living experiences, to free people from debtors' prison. And it's quite possible that Wesley considered the use of debt as part of another system which enslaved. In other words, when he says it's the vilest form of slavery that ever saw the sun, many others would see debt slavery as another form of slavery. There were some debates actually in the 19th century in the States about which form of slavery was worse. This is an absurd and offensive debate because both forms are horrible. But Wesley's sensitivity to every form of slavery or marginalization or ways in which people were impoverished is significant to highlight. In 1747, Wesley writes a medical manual, Primitive Physique, or an easy and natural method of curing most diseases. This is a medical manual for people to use at home. It's not for medical schools, but for people who couldn't afford it, didn't have access to doctors and hospitals like we would think of today. It was based upon the best herbal science of the day, and was used not only in England, but throughout Europe and the United States. It went through 23 editions in Wesley's lifetime, and the last edition, the 37th edition, is published in 1859. So all this illustrates Wesley's intelligence, his affirmation of contemporary science, and his concrete and concern and energy for works addressing both body and soul. And there's an essay by Deborah Manning in the Cambridge Companion, Wesley as Advisor on Health and Healing, which is especially good. From 1749 to 1759, resistance from the Church of England, that is the Anglican Church, grows in response to the growth of the Methodist movement. Increasingly, Wesley is essentially appointing pastors and de facto acting as a bishop, an identity he will increasingly adopt as resistance from the Church of England endures and grows. Now, as problems in the American colonies grow in the mid-18th century, Wesley strongly supports colonists' demands for liberty and justice, and he repeatedly condemns slavery. Slavery had been abolished in England in 1833, and in theory in all English colonies. But Wesley also staunchly opposes the idea of a colonial revolution. In 1769, the first Methodist missionaries are sent to America. And notably, this is before the American Revolution. In 1784, this is now after the Revolution, Wesley appoints Francis Asbury in the United States as General Superintendent of the Methodist Church in America, a church which is now, after the Declaration of Independence and the colonial victory, clearly not a part of the Church of England. So now, at this point, it is clear we have a different church which has emerged. Now, because of Wesley's opposition to the American Revolutionary War, he is, in that sense, an unpopular figure in the United States, and so Asbury strategically does not accept his appointment from Wesley until American pastors vote upon and elect him general and superintendent at what is, among Methodists, the famous Christmas Conference held in Baltimore in 1784. In 1791, John Wesley dies on March 2nd at the age of 88. His last words are, "The best of all, God is with us."